Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Respecting the Beer podcast. My name is Gary Arndt, and with me, as usual, is Bobby Fleshman and Allison McCoy. And we have a very special guest today. Now, every time you've probably gone to have a beer, it's often called a cold one. And cold refrigerated beer is kind of the norm. But it wasn't always the case. There was a time when beer was almost always room temperature. Well, our guest today is Nicola Twilley. She's the author of Frostbite, How Refrigeration Changed Our Food, Our Planet, and Ourselves. And she's also the co-host of the very popular Gastropod podcast. Nicola, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So why don't we start out? Let's just go back to the origins. If you lived in a cold climate, because I've done episodes on this as well in my show, it was kind of easy to make things warm. You just burn something. But making something cold in a climate that's not cold was much more challenging. So why don't you give us like the 50,000 foot view of this problem throughout history?
Yeah, for most of human history, even before modern humans really evolved, we've known how to make things warm. We've had control of fire. People argue that's even what made us human. That's what enabled us to sort of get the big brains that define being a modern human. So that piece was easy, like you say. But for most of human history, making cold was not an option. And natural cold, as you point out, is sort of fleeting, ephemeral, dependent on where you live, the time of year, the seasonality. In parts of the world, you might get no natural snow or ice, but you have, say, a cave where it's a little bit cooler and a steady temperature year round. But really, that was your only option. And people didn't understand even what cold was. It was just genuinely puzzling to some of the finest minds, like, Leonardo da Vinci, Robert Boyle, Francis Bacon, Galileo. All of them kind of wrestled with this idea of what the hell is cold? Some people thought it was a type of material, like a frigorific atom was the expression people used. Some people thought it was a property that was sort of generated in the north and traveled, maybe by air, maybe underground. No one knew. So it was really, Robert Boyle at one point in his writings complains about it. There is no topic in natural history that has given him as much frustration as this. He can't make head or tail. Francis Bacon actually died investigating cold. He was stuffing ice into a chicken when he caught a chill. Okay, so people also blame the fact that he then went to bed to get over his cold and the sheets were damp, which kind of helped. But he died from a chill brought on from investigating cold. Descartes sort of decided that basically we'd have an easier time proving the existence of God than the existence of cold. So it really is a tricky topic for most of human history.
So what were the steps that were taken for people to start to get control over this, or the ability to create cold?
Long before we could create it, people were getting a handle on at least how to make natural cold a little more portable and useful and bring it to where you wanted and store it for a little bit. As far back as, prehistory in the Middle East, you have people bringing ice down from the mountains, storing it in purpose-built ice houses. You have a big leap forward in Renaissance Italy, where Giambattista della Porta, who's famous for all kinds of things, also figures out that if you add salt to ice, you can lower its melting point enough to then chill, say, custard to make an ice cream. And you get this huge kind of cold boom. They call it a new ice age in Renaissance Italy, where people are starting to be like, oh, we can make ice, we could freeze custards, we can make wine slushies for summer. This is great. The first person to make ice without natural cold was actually a Scottish doctor in Glasgow. A pupil of his had noticed that if you put a thermometer in wine and then took it out, it would get cooler almost immediately. It's the wine evaporating off that does that, because cold, as we now know, is sort of this sense of loss as heat moves away. When you have something that evaporates that fast, you produce cooling. William Cullen, this Scottish doctor, was like, that's intriguing. Wonder if I could use that somehow. Develops a system using ether, actually, was his evaporant of choice, and a vacuum. So he's building on the works of his predecessors to to get that evaporation in a vacuum that produced, enough cold, basically pulls out enough heat to freeze some water. And it's just a party trick. No one knows what to do about it. He writes up a paper. No one reads it. At the end of the paper, he just sort of says, well, this seems like worthy of investigation. But 100 years go by before anyone does consider it worthy of investigation because it's just not clear that it's something that we can scale up and why we would want to do it, honestly.
And spoiler alert, the evaporation technique is basically what's still driving a lot of this today, right?
Oh, totally. William Cullen was on it. He just had no idea what he was on.
Allison, you look like you're sitting in the front row of class and are just dying to raise your hand.
I love it so much. Oh my God. So I listened to your podcast, Gastropod, when you talked about the book and you shared the story. And in saying that, I don't think anyone's ever read this paper. And I was like, I'm a chemist. I have a PhD. I should read this. I teach thermodynamics. I can do it. I tried to find it and it's behind every single paywall. And it was published in like 1758. So new personal challenge is I'm going to read this paper.
Oh, I can send it to you.
Oh my God, yes. Because there's so many things in the history of thermodynamics where it's just a footnote, like the idea of entropy. So Ludwig Boltzmann's major contribution to thermo and understanding like why throughout all of human history, cold has been really hard to do based off the zeroth law of thermodynamics. We're going deep, everyone. Just hold on. It's going to be great. Heat goes from hot to cold. Cold can't stay cold, it's going to become hot. And it's basically from an idea called entropy. And Boltzmann wrote this in a footnote. And he's like, oh yeah, by the way, S equals K log W. And that's like now on his tombstone. It's such an important, the reason that it's so hard and human history really, it has truly changed based off this invention of refrigeration because hot goes from hot to cold. Cold can't stay cold. So in the idea of thinking of all the different things that have truly changed the world, when I heard that you'd written this book about refrigeration, I was like, oh my God. We wouldn't be brewers if we didn't have an ability to make things cold because of entropy. That's amazing. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say.
Oh, you know what? I'll speak for myself. I'm not a scientist and I didn't study science in school. And I myself was also a bit like, so what is cold? I mean, yeah. I think most people, they know their fridge is cold. They know they love their beer cold. But do they have any idea that cold is not a thing? Your fridge is not making cold. Your fridge is just a box where heat is being transferred out of it repeatedly.
I teach my students when we're working on, I teach it in the introductory chemistry courses and my advanced thermodynamics courses, where I say, okay, heat is the thing. Cold is just lack of heat. And so we do everything with respect to heat. We actually never talk about cold. Cold just means you don't have heat. And heat hasn't gotten there yet because heat wants to, and it will find a way unless you're smart, like Cullen was. Oh, I'm going to read his paper.
Yeah, but it is funny also because, it was a curiosity. Here was this thing that people didn't understand. It was confusing in a lot of ways. And yet, once we had a way of controlling it, there wasn't an idea for how that could be useful to us other than as kind of a party trick. So there's some, early kind of attempts of we can cool a chamber for the king. And it's like at Westminster Abbey or whatever. And it's just a party trick. People could make a little ice for a slushie or again, these sort of decadent treats rather than the essentials of life. It really wasn't seen as something that had a mass application at all. And that always blows my mind because this is really recently. It's 1755 when William Cullen writes this. So yeah. Is the first person to make cold, artificially.
Well, and yeah, Robert Boyle was in late 1600s. And then in France, you had the thermodynamicists really pushing the way ballooning. That was the big thing. So in the middle of 1700s, the French had figured out that if you heat up air and you can create these balloons, then you can ride in balloons. And they just made gazillion dollars with balloon rides. But they were so focused on the heat part, they kind of forgot about what they were doing with the remaining bits was the cold part, once you move the heat from one place to another.
But I think because we'd never had it at scale and never been able to control it at scale, there wasn't a good imagination of what we could do with it if we could.
So true.
You know, like we had already seen that heat was useful in so many ways because we'd been able to have control of that and use it, bend it to our will for so long. So we knew it had all these uses. Cold, people, yes, they knew it preserved food. They didn't know why. They knew it, was refreshing in the summer. But there wasn't sort of a sense of what a world in which we could make cold on demand could look like.
And then the brewers came in.
Pretty much.
Why don't you talk about that then? I'm guessing this is late 18th, early 19th century. Cold in the form of ice harvesting becomes kind of an industry, right? In a pretty big industry.
Yeah, this is the funny thing. It took natural ice becoming a big industry for people to understand, oh, if we could make ice, that would also be useful. And so the natural ice industry, again, people had been harvesting it for millennia and storing it in these rudimentary kind of ice caves and using it to chill their drinks in summer, if they were wealthy. It takes a high school dropout called Frederick Tudor from Boston. He goes on vacation with his sickly elder brother to Cuba. Because they're from New England, bless their hearts, they're like, oh my God, it's so hot. We can't handle the heat. And Frederick has this brainwave. He sort of says, well, I would kill for an ice drink right now, because his family, like a lot of wealthy New England families, had an ice house for their own personal consumption, like for ice drinks in the summer. And then he thinks, whoa, I bet if you could get Cubans ice, they would go crazy for ice water in the summer, or iced wine, or iced beverages. I'm going to do this and make a fortune. And everyone, literally everyone, is just like, wow, Frederick, you have lost your mind. How are you going to get ice to Cuba? How are you? And like, what are you talking about? And Frederick is like, just, no interest in the doubters. He's like, I'm shortly going to have more money than I even know what to do with. He's full of confidence. And it's, of course, a disaster at first. He ships the ice to Cuba. No one knows what to do with it. No one wants it. It melts on the way home. No one has anywhere to store it. He hasn't thought anything through. It's an extremely relatable story. Basically, everything you could think through, he hasn't done, even down to the fact of like at the time of year where you can harvest the ice, Boston Harbor is iced over, so you can't take it anywhere. So you have to build ice houses. He hasn't built those. So what should an ice house look like? The whole thing is just a catastrophe on several levels. He goes broke 3 times, goes to jail twice, and that somehow he persists and it works. He develops a business model. He develops the technology. It's a whole long story. And there's actually a great book on this topic called The Frozen Ice Trade by Gavin Waitman, which is a really fun read. And that, obviously, you should also read it in my book. But he figures it out and he turns it into a global business. He's shipping ice to Australia and to Calcutta and to South Africa. Being able to have ice at this scale, it starts to become useful. And one of the early adopters are brewers in North America.
Why? What was so special about brewers? Because they had been, brewing ales and whatnot for centuries. What was so special about this ability to cool and chill that brewers were able to take advantage of?
Well, so this is where I feel like a brewer should answer the question. But my understanding is just that what happens is in the 1850s, in the mid-1800s, say, there's a huge wave of German immigration to the U.S. And those folks would rather drink lager than ale. Now, ale, for that, it's top fermented and it can be fermented at higher temperatures. Lager prefers lower temperatures. Am I right?
Right. So I'll jump in there. That's a good segue. So first of all, anything gets driven by market, right? The fact that brewers are even involved in this story means that somebody was spending money on what they were making. And they were able to become the engineers and the technicians that drove it, I imagine. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there's a couple important stages in making beer. I'm going
to stop you just right now. It's just part of the podcast is I stop him and I turn it into more entertaining banter. No, so when we do a beer tour, bring people into the back of the room and we really divide up the brewing process into hot side and cold side. And so the hot part is where, you extract the sugars and all that. And the cold side is actually where the beer is truly made, is in controlling those temperatures. Now you can
The
speak.
really generic joke we always tell is the true microbrewers are the yeast.
The yeasties.
It's something people never laugh at, but that all happens on the cold side, right?
Cool.
So, but on the cold side, where fermentation begins, where the sugars are being converted into alcohol and carbon dioxide, that requires a certain temperature in order to get the same product or the product you're interested in. Ales and lagers both can actually ferment at a wide range of temperature, but the result won't be as desirable unless the lagers are fermented at colder, say 40 to 50 degrees.
Fun side story.
Yeah.
So we did a experiment when we were in a homebrew club to where all the brewers, they brewed all the same batch, and then everyone had a different homework assignment to put the different beers into different temperatures for the fermentation.
Oh, so cool.
Oh yeah, and it was so great. And so then it all started with the same initial batch, and then assuming that you followed your instructions, and we had some lagering freezers, and so we were able to actually lager some of the things, and others didn't have it. And some people kept it really hot, and then we tasted the end result. And, oh, the variation! Wow, it was so bad. Like everything was so different, and temperature. Everyone was like, "Whoa, okay, so this is how I need to really invest in the lagering refrigerator."
And so fermentation's the first piece, but like Allison's saying, there's this longer
the lagering
aging
part, yeah.
period, which is what lagers use it several different ways, and one of those ways is the storage time at cold temperatures. And there's something that happens whether you buy into it entirely or not. There's something magical about having a beer sit cold for 12 weeks and come out the other side a little more refined, and we're getting a better sense on the quantitative side of what's going on, but it still holds, and brewers are very traditional as much as they are experimentalist.
But not only that, it's not even magical. I mean, chemistry slows down when it's cold. You don't have as much thermal energy in the environment. There's not as much thermal heat, and you get rid of the heat, the chemicals, the molecules themselves are like, well, I'm kind of tired. I'm going to move a little slower. That's called kinetic molecular theory, also known as and humans are the same way. We also slow down when it's cold.
That's how refrigeration works. It just slows things down.
And I think it's worth, it's popping in my head, the better way to tell this story. I think the Germans, they started with, I won't be able to lay out all the players in this story, but they created what was called the Reinheitsgebot. And before that, there's another document that drove how beer had to be made in Bavaria. And
the year was 1560.
Security laws.
Yes, 500 years, almost to the year that we opened. We tried to be open in 2016. We made it a little bit later, but we wanted to be 500 years to the...
No one was paying attention.
No one cares except us. We understand that. But in any case, they were coming out of a period where beer was not so awesome, and they were trying to make lighter beers. They were based on the pale ales that were coming from the United Kingdom, and Pilsner was born, and Helles and so forth. And they were trying to make better beer than even in the Czech Republic was. And in order to get there, they needed to hold back the bacteria that would cause it to go sour. And inadvertently, they realized that keeping beer cold, brewing in the cold months, they were able to avoid that, and it would be a better product to sell through the summer.
That also where the beer garden originated.
And then the beer garden is, the way I'm told it came about, was they would put gardens over the cellars where they kept these beers at these cooler temperatures.
Chestnut trees, I think, grew really well over these cavities of cellars.
And that just an inadvertent side effect is tables were thrown under these trees, and that became what we connect with as a beer garden.
And of course, then the trees are taking the thermal energy from the sun, which is keeping
that energy transition.
It's like is it in Iceland that they have all those houses that have the gardens on top and such? It's a temperature control.
Yep.
That's amazing. I did not know that about the beer garden.
Yeah, I don't know when I heard that, but that's where it was born. And then you fast forward to 1840, and I guess you get the Germans moving to the United States, and they are trying to replicate what they were doing in their homeland. And I think there was a confluence of technologies that led to the need for refrigeration to replicate that.
He knows I'm about to ask a question, but our friend from Cuba, from the
Frederick Tudor, yeah,
him. So did he do the invention of making ice? He just transported. He was more of like a distributor then.
Yeah, he is the person who really made natural ice, the natural ice business, into a business and available at scale. And that was initially what those lager brewers in the US were reliant on. They had caves, obviously. They either dug caves or used caves, as in Europe. But it gets just really very hot, especially in Midwestern parts of the country. They were setting up in St. Louis and they were setting up in Chicago. And they were finding it really hard to keep those temperatures reliably cool. And so they were the biggest users of natural ice, just period. The brewing industry was just all in on natural ice, and they bought up huge amounts of ice. They had their own ice houses. They would deliberately buy up lakes and ponds that they could control to make sure they had enough ice. And then what really happened is there was just a series of what they called ice famines at the time, these really hot summers. 1854 was apparently so hot. And okay, it's so hot. What do you want? You want a nice cold lager? That'd be nice. But the brewers haven't been able to make any because there isn't any ice. And there's all these laments you can find in contemporary newspaper coverage and so on. The brewers are just like, this is killing us. We don't have enough ice. And so that kind of unreliability, plus, the meat trade was starting to use a lot of ice. So there was competition. You said earlier, everything is driven by market. Well, once there was increasing demand for ice, it's a limited resource. So prices are going up. And then the other thing that's happening is increasingly Americans are moving into cities, and they're just more and more of those Americans, and they are not treating their wastewater at all. And so you start to get a situation where the ice isn't really very nice either. In the 1850s, that's not such a problem. It really picks up toward the end of the century. But these brewers there in St. Louis are just like, wow, the ice is getting really pretty grody. We don't want to be using this. We talked about sort of this kind of breakthrough where William Cullen figured out how to make ice, but didn't know what to do with it. He's figured out how to make ice. By the time Fred Tudor shows there's a big market for this, it's actually a global market, and it's a hungry market, and the brewers want it and the meat packers want it. By the time you get those two things together, suddenly people are paying attention. And then they go back to this idea of okay, if you could evaporate ether or something like that in a vacuum, could we do this? And you start getting people tinkering with machines, and you get the first working mechanical refrigeration, and bless their hearts. Again, you think, of course, they couldn't imagine it. They used a refrigeration machine to make ice. They didn't use it to cool a room or to cool beer or to cool anything. They used it to make ice because in their head, ice was the thing that made cold. So they used the first, machine to make ice artificially was sold actually to two breweries, one in London and one in Australia, in the 1850s. So that's when it happens.
Bobby, I have a question about lagers and kind of like the supply chain. You're mentioning that it has to be brewed when it's cold, has to be stored when it's cold. Does it have to always be cold during its entire life? In other words, could you brew it cold, then put it in something room temperature, ship it somewhere else, and cool it down? Does that ruin it, or does it have to be?
There are two.
Only if you want me to come slap you somewhere.
I was going to say, my understanding is for sure no. It has to be kept cold.
The other side to the refrigeration story is the pasteurization and Louis Pasteur side. And you can actually preserve product. You can preserve foods these days. We understand the damage, quote, done during pasteurization, and we limit that in order to control the bacterial or the aging effects of these. So we can have things then after they've been pasteurized, they can actually be more or less stable on the shelf. The problem is that, as Allison will tell you, that every 10 degrees Celsius, the chemical reactions will occur, the natural chemistry, the degradation, the increase of entropy,
it's almost
et cetera.
like one of those, it's like, imagine an elevator. You could take the stairs, but it would take forever. But there's an elevator, and if the elevator happens to take you to that floor, the chemical, you're going to get off on that floor. The chemical reaction is going to happen. If it has a thermal energy, if it's on that elevator and it happens to stop at that floor, that chemical reaction is going to occur. And a lot of chemical reactions are driven by the heat energy that's available. So you give it that extra boost, and it's like, oh, I can go this way instead of that way.
But slowing down close to freezing,
right?
We're looking at more or less stabilizing that.
And we've had several beers that we're in the beer business, I guess. And so we might leave a 6-pack in the back of the truck. And I was like, oh crap, it's still out there, and I'll drink it. And I know it doesn't taste the same. These beers are like my children. I know.
We do not pasteurize, and there's a philosophical and technical.
Well, but I can
Yeah.
taste a difference between one that's been hot and one that's been cold all its life. But it's very subtle. Very subtle.
Just to say what those early brewers were doing, Busch actually, Adolphus Busch, he was the first to pasteurize beer, but he was also the first to use a refrigerated rail car. Now, the rail car wasn't using a machine, it was using natural ice. But he was fully invested in both, actually, just to, again, try and control that quality. And prior to that, often, the beer would be sold, within a couple of miles of where it was made. You had this intensely local beer scene. The invention of the iced refrigerated rail car, it's often credited to the meat industry, and it was a big effort in the meat industry. Gustavus Swift was sort of a pioneer. There's some debate, and I don't think any certainty over who actually put the first working refrigerated rail car on the road, because there were a lot of failures before it worked. But certainly Busch was right there at the same time that Swift got this going, right there with his own design for a ice-cooled refrigerated rail car so that he could ship his beer.
And I think it is worth patting the large brewers on the back then and now.
Mm-hmm.
They do it. If it's not exciting, that's one conversation, but it's the same every time.
Well, and the amount of money
and
to
quality's highest.
invest in that
Totally.
infrastructure, like that initial, like there's a reason that I'm guessing that Miller and Budweiser were also big players in the refrigeration, not just Busch. And who else is?
Well, Budweiser is Anheuser-Busch.
Yeah, I guess that's
Yeah.
true.
Yeah.
Yeah, Anheuser.
Mhm.
But yeah, like they're, as much as they might not necessarily reflect the craft beer scene, which is more local, and we're kind of getting away from these, really large
And-
industrialized.
And I should now give you the
cold
other side of it.
shipments.
You can't have the best double IPA in the world unless it's kept cold from beginning to end.
Mm.
There's no way you can pasteurize that and allow those aromas to survive. Just the way that chemistry plays out.
Yeah, I think we can agree that refrigeration has been a boon to beer. I mean, I grew up in England, and you can have a warm pint of bitter, and I live in the US, and I would rather have an IPA any day of the week. So yeah.
I was going to bring up the story of mild and porter and so on, and how those beers had their shelf life and how they had to be blended from the publican who worked behind the bar, because they would go sour, and you could create multiple beers from 3 different hand pulls. And that's a story of how beer was not pasteurized and not kept cold, and you had to be creative.
So no kidding. So you'd go into the pub and you'd say, "Oh, I'd like a pint of mild." You weren't asking for a pint of, Truman's or whatever, because it would be a blend.
Exactly. A mild would have been one that hadn't soured yet. And these days we associate it with alcohol level, but that's not really what's happening. And then you could get a porter, which would be a house combination of a brown ale and a mild and so on. And there would be ways to strike that flavor profile that they cater to.
This is so interesting, because one of the things I argue in the book is that a lot of the flavors that we're used to food-wise are actually like pre-refrigeration food preservation techniques, the kind of salty, smoky, sour, funky flavors that people love and that we have sort of evolved to really enjoy as flavor bombs are actually just us trying to fight the microbes that want to, get to our food before we can. But it turns out the same with beer, huh?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
These styles that I thought were just styles turn out to be an attempt to make something drinkable out of something that's going off.
Right. Yeah. I mean, on its face, I talk a lot about how styles come about because of local water supply. But then when we get into these more complex issues of storage and stability, you're definitely going to get into the preferences that come about for those reasons.
I had no idea. That's amazing. I should have spoken to you before I wrote this.
Part 2.
There you go.
That concludes the first part of our discussion with Nicola Twilley. Stay tuned for the next episode when we get into how refrigeration turned the United States into a beer drinking country. Remember to join our Facebook group and support us over on Patreon, links to both of which are in the show notes. Until then, please remember to respect the beer.